I'm Reena Agarwal, the Robert Emmett McDonough Professor of Business and Professor of Finance here at Georgetown University. I'm also the director of our Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy. So welcome to Georgetown University. Welcome to the McDonough School and the conference today. We are absolutely delighted to once again partner with the Financial Times to organize today's conference on financial markets quality. This is our fourth event, and pretty much all of our events that are open to the public, we do them in partnership with the FT, and we're delighted about this partnership. So I want to welcome Gina Chan from the FT. Gina is going to be moderating the first panel. Just a little bit about Georgetown University. We believe we are one of the world's leading academic and research institutions. We are offering transformational educational experience that prepares the next generation of global citizens to lead and make a real difference in the world. The mission of the Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy is to provide thought leadership for global finance. The center provides innovative, influential, and thoughtful commentary. We sponsor relevant research that impacts practice and policy. Here at the McDonough School, we really believe in excellence in research to impact practice. We host dialogues, we host conferences involving scholars, involving practitioners, and policymakers on key financial market issues. Through these activities, the center contributes to an informed, solutions-oriented discussion regarding critical issues faced by global financial markets. We really do believe that it is the responsibility of universities like Georgetown University to provide unbiased analysis. We are not an advocacy group of any kind, so we really provide unbiased analysis that can guide both market participants and guide policymakers. So just to give you an idea of some of what the center is doing, literally within a 2-month period, earlier this month, we had a Careers in Capital Markets event for our students, and it completely fills up the auditorium that we have in this building. Today, we have this conference. Tomorrow, we have what we call our Hill series, and the topic is housing finance. So we conduct this regular congressional policy briefing series on Capitol Hill, which is for senior staffers, and we do this in partner with the Milken Institute. On October 22nd, we have an event in New York, Investing in Global Innovation. We're going to be focusing on infrastructure, energy, healthcare, and the disruption that's taking place in capital raising. On October 29th, in partnership with Joanne Hill is here, we're going to be sponsoring and partnering on an event on women in ETFs. Okay. So you can get a sense of we're keeping pretty busy here at the center. We have a lot going on. I do want to introduce one person in the room, John Jacobs. Where are you? There's John. The center has a distinguished policy program, and our distinguished fellow for this year is John Jacobs, now formerly of NASDAQ, or John is still doing some work with NASDAQ. So the center being located in Washington, D.C., which I consider to be not just the nation's capital, but it's a global capital. We have the IMF, the World Bank, the embassies, and a lot of international institutions here. And there's so much decision-making taking place in Washington. And we believe Georgetown and the center has the ability to convene people from business, from policy bodies, and from academia when important issues need to be resolved. And today's event is one such example. Our events have very strong partnerships and participation from the private sector, from policymakers, and from academia. So very often we'll have representation from the IMF, the World Bank. Today you'll see tons of people from the SEC, CFTC, FINRA, Treasury, Capitol Hill, White House. So we really do cover a lot of ground here. And this is our fourth conference, and quite honestly, we continue to do this because the market comes to us and says, you guys do it differently, and we want to have this thoughtful discussion. So again, there are issues to be resolved. So let's have this conference at Georgetown. I want to thank our participants and our sponsors that include BATS, New York Stock Exchange, ICE, NASDAQ, T. Rowe Price, BlackRock, PIMCO, Gabelli Funds, ITG, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, OTC Markets, who have all joined us today for this event. So I'm going to stop here. A warm welcome to all of you. And we're going to start off our first keynote speaker, Commissioner Michael Piowar from the SEC. And my colleague, Turan Bali, is going to introduce Commissioner Piowar.
Thank you, Rina. Thank you all for coming. My name is Turan Bali. I'm a chair professor of finance and the finance department chair. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Mike Piowar. He's a Georgetown graduate, one of our alumni. And Mike received his MBA from Georgetown and PhD from Penn State. And he started as an assistant professor of finance at Iowa State, and he worked on market microstructure. He published quite a bit, actually. He published a number of articles in leading academic journals, including Journal of Finance. He just mentioned two. I knew it was one. And then his first tenure at SEC was in the Office of Economic Analysis. And then Mike served at the White House as a senior economist at the President's Council of Economic Advisors. More recently, he served as the chief economist at the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. He also worked on a number of important SEC-related oversight issues. And about 2 years ago, in August 2013, Mike was appointed by President Obama as SEC commissioner. Without further ado, I'd like to invite to the podium Dr. Mike Piowar.
Welcome, Mike. We are honored to have you back here on the Hilltop. My name is Jim Angel. I'm a finance professor here as well. And my orders are to keep us strictly on time. So get right to the business. Great. So, Mike, it's been 5 years after Dodd-Frank. And Dodd-Frank did a lot, but one of the things it did not do is really overhaul the structure of our regulatory system. Now, in countries like the United Kingdom, they've actually really restructured and overhauled their regulation. So I'm going to ask you this. If you had a clean sheet of paper, if you could do any kind of legislation or structural overhaul of the U.S. regulatory system, what would it look like?
Great. Excellent question. First of all, two housekeeping announcements. First of all, thank you, Rena, for inviting me here. It's great to be back. As Tarun mentioned, I got my MBA here 21 years ago, just celebrated the 20th anniversary last year, so it's great to be back here. Second, any of you that's ever seen an SEC commissioner speak knows what's coming next. My disclaimer, anything I say does not necessarily reflect the views of any other commissioner, the commission as a whole, or anyone on the staff, and in fact, oftentimes do not. So we'll go from there. Your question was about regulatory overhaul, and you mentioned the UK and their decision of how they were going to restructure and compare to what we're doing. It's interesting, when I travel abroad, the questions that most regulatory jurisdictions have is, do they want to have the so-called single peak model of regulation or a twin peaks model of regulation, where you have the single peak model where you would have a prudential or banking regulator in the same regulator as a markets regulator for the financial markets? Or do you want to have a twin peaks model where you separate the prudential or banking regulator from the markets regulator? In the U.S., I have what we call, we have what I call a rolling hills model, right? We have not one, but two markets regulators. We have the SEC and the CFTC. we have not one, not two, but three prudential regulators, the FDIC, the Fed, the OCC, and actually four if you count the National Credit Union Administration as well, too. It makes absolutely no sense. During the Dodd-Frank negotiations, Chairman Dodd, who I was on the Republican side, but Chairman Dodd talked about the alphabet soup of regulators, meaning all the different acronyms that we had out there. We not only did not rationalize the system, but we actually added to the alphabet that was there, right? We got rid of the OTS, the Office of Thrift Supervision, but they were recidivist, right? You think back to the savings and loan crisis, I guess 2 strikes and you're out. But that was it. We added the CFPB, the OFR, the FSOC, and a bunch of new powers to the existing agencies. We have overlapping jurisdictions. We have sort of odd structures where we divide up things like the futures markets and the derivatives market between the SEC and the CFTC. Even though we have the same players, whether they're trading swaps or security-based swaps, we have 2 sets of rules and 2 sets of rule books that people have to comply with. And then, a little less than a year ago, we had, the Treasury flash crash. And I started wondering, well, wait a minute, the Treasury cash market, who oversees that? Well, it turns out we got 3. We got Treasury writes the rules, the New York Fed monitors the rules, and the SEC enforces the rules. Right? So we got 3 regulators, or do we have none? Right? The old John Madden thing for those football fans. He said, if you got 2 or 3 running backs, you really have none. The Treasury flash crash sort of reminded us that there's places here that we didn't even think about in terms of rationalizing the regulatory system. If I had a clean sheet, I'd start over and think about potentially one prudential regulator, 1 markets regulator, and then go from there.
Moving up from Dodd-Frank to the recent past, August 24th was pretty scary. It was the first test of many of our circuit breakers, and we saw a lot of interesting things on the 24th. So what have we learned from August 24th, and what changes, if any, should we make?
Sure. So let me take a step back and sort of compare what August 24th, obviously we had a lot of volatility in the market, compare that to what we saw in May of 2010, right? You think back, what's different now from then? First of all, the Commission, we have a ready source of access to data that we can actually start to analyze. In fact, our folks are looking at that right now. If you think back to May of 2010 and the flash crash, it literally took weeks to collect all the data from all the equity markets around the world. And I see Greg Berman here, who used to be at the Commission, was in charge of doing that. I mean, just literally weeks to actually collect all the data. And one of the things that came out of the May 2000 flash crash is that we need to have better access to comprehensive data. We have a long-term plan to get something called the Consolidated Audit Trail, which would track orders all the way through the systems when they become trades. In the meantime, we have access to something called the MIDAS system. Some of you may have seen it on our website. We put out some statistics and some analysis for folks to look at, but we can now look at them. We now have access to look at the markets in real time, to have conversations with market participants, and to download this data and start analyzing it. We have folks both in the Division of Trading and Markets and the Division of Investment Management looking at a lot of the things that occurred around all these volatility events, right? The big questions like what were the role of high-frequency traders? Did they, quote unquote, cause it? Did they exacerbate the volatility? Did they actually help mitigate the volatility? All those types of questions. And then we saw particular dislocations in prices in exchange-traded funds, which have received a lot of attention recently. And there's been a lot of folks have come up with a lot of various explanations as to potentially what caused those dislocations. And so there's some hypotheses that have been put forward that we can test now with empirical data. So some have suggested perhaps that the limit up, limit downs that were put in place after the 2010 flash crash perhaps had there was unintended consequences to that. So if you think about exchange-traded funds, there's really 2 levels of limit up, limit downs that we have here, right? The exchange-traded fund itself is a security subject to limit up, limit down. And then you have the underlying securities themselves are also subject to limit up, limit downs. And if you have individual securities in a portfolio and a few of them stop trading or hit the limit up, limit down, perhaps that's not a problem, the arbitrage mechanism for ETFs. But if you have a lot of them, does that potentially create some problems? What's interesting is that, and folks at the SEC are still looking into that. What's interesting, I don't have any sort of data to present today on this, but one of the things I learned was that not only did we have limit downs on the way down hit, and when we had the dislocations, But there were also a lot of limit ups that hit on the way up when the dislocations went away. So the question is, to what extent did the limit up, limit downs actually lead to some of these dislocations? We can test that with empirical data. Other folks have suggested that differences in the opening mechanisms on the various exchanges contributed to this. Well, we have a natural experiment. We have some ETFs that traded on the NYC, that are listed on the NYC, some that are listed on NASDAQ, and we have variation in those as to the underlying. Some are solely listed ETFs on the NYC and have just NYC listed stocks and NASDAQ, and we have a mix of those. We can actually look at all that data and try to net out and try to figure out to what extent did the opening mechanisms of those things try to look at that as well too. And then also, just the overall volatility itself, keeping in mind that there was a lot of fundamental volatility in the market that day as well too, in addition to the trading volatility.
Speaking of volatility, as we're all waiting to hear what the Fed will or will not do today, there's a lot of concern about interest rates and the fixed income market. Mm-hmm. And indeed, this afternoon, we're going to see some really explosive results from Professor Harris about the retail execution quality in the bond market. And so I want to give you a chance to preempt it and say, hey, what is the SEC doing in the fixed income world?
Great. It's always fun to front run Larry, so it'll be fun to do that. We're doing a number of things in the fixed income market, and with an eye towards focusing on retail investors, right? So when I came to the commission 11 years ago, I had the fortune of working with Larry Harris we were working on initiatives to increase post-trade transparency in the bond market, and in both the corporate bond market and the municipal bond market. And one of the things that was shocking to me, in fact, I thought it was a mistake when I started running the programs, was that the spreads, or the markups as they call them in the bond market, for retail investors were just huge, something on the order of 4 or 5%. Think of a year or two's worth of interest foregone in this. And the other thing that was interesting or shocking to me was that if you plot transaction costs as a function of trade size in the bond market, it's the opposite of what you see in the equity markets. In the equity markets, retail investors typically get the inside spread. Institutional investors have to work their orders. There's information leakage, that sort of thing. And so overall transactions costs are higher. In the bond market, you see the exact opposite. So what that suggests is that the large buy-side institutions are doing quite well vis-a-vis their work with the dealers, but retail investors did not have access to price information either on a post-trade basis or on a pre-trade basis. The Commission, working with the MSRB and FINRA in both of these markets, have added post-trade transparency in these markets, and spreads have gone down. Markups have gone down, but particularly in the larger retail size orders or the smaller institutional orders, where you have the more sophisticated investors who know that TRACE or the MS system and the MSRB is there, and they're getting the benefit of TRACE. But we're still seeing large markups in the retail space, and we're doing the Commission has sort of embarked on, or working with MSRB and FINRA, sort of 3 areas in this space. One is to improve disclosure of markups, particularly in riskless principal transactions, to retail investors. So if a trade is done on an agency basis, on the confirm that the customer gets, they see what the commission that was paid. But if a trade was done on a principal basis, they don't see what the markup is, unless they go to the TRACE data and see that, oh, the dealer bought the bond from Jim at 92 and sold it to me at 96. We both see just our individual trades, and we see that there's no commission on that, so we must not have paid any transactions costs. We want to improve that. The second is improving best execution requirements in the bond markets. FINRA has had best execution requirements for corporate bonds for quite some time, but it hasn't been updated in a long time. The MSRB is working on introducing best execution requirements for the municipal bond market. And importantly, having the MSRB and FINRA work together to make sure that those requirements are, if not exactly the same written down, at least consistent with one another. And the third area that I'm really excited about, and you alluded to the work that Larry's doing here, is improving pre-trade transparency for retail investors. If you think about the ability of retail investors to see, well, what do I think this bond should be trading at? It's very difficult for them to find that type of information. And so we're going to be doing some initiatives in that over the coming months, trying to figure out exactly what we want to do in this space. My preference would be to not to endorse a particular model. We have a lot of folks out there that are developing what they think is a better mousetrap to provide transparency in this market, to provide trading, different alternative trading systems. but at least provide a booster shot, if you will, to the industry to try to move in that direction. And given concerns about liquidity in the markets and that dealer inventories are down, we're seeing that even large institutions are looking towards moving towards alternative trading systems to sort of fill their liquidity needs going forward.
Thank you. Now, I could keep you pinned down with questions all morning, but I'm under strict orders to keep us on time. So I'd like to open it up now to the audience for questions and answers. So who would like to start?
Sure. So we're not in the banking sphere, but that's another layer of regulation we have as well too, right? So I mentioned the MSRB and FINRA. So we have self-regulation, right? We also in the accounting space, we also have the PCAOB for the auditing firms as well too, and then we also have state regulation in the securities realm as well too. And so there's a number of layers that we hit on there. The state regulation versus federal regulation, particularly in the offering of securities, is front and center into some of the initiatives we're doing under what's called the Jobs Act to help open up access to capital for certain issuers. Certain issuers are allowed to do certain intrastate offerings and not trip the federal securities laws, and then they're subject to the laws of the state. We're working on finalizing rules in the crowdfunding space, so the really small companies and getting access to capital. The federal statute is very prescriptive. Some of us think that it's so prescriptive that it may not work, but yet we can do things to provide comfort for the state regulators that issuers in those states, if they do intrastate offerings, that they don't trip the federal securities laws as well too. So that's another added dimension of the complexity of the environment that we have.
Thanks a lot. For the retail investors who may not be fully aware of what Trace offers them in the online access, is there, I mean, I use it sometimes, but I'm a bond market professional or
right.
play one on TV. But is there any kind of like simplified like introduction to how to use the site? Because I think that might be helpful. Separate question related to using Trace for high yield and convertible bonds, which is my field. Do you think that it'd be possible on you talk about listing the markup and whatnot? Do you think it'd be possible on statements for these bonds that are potentially more equity sensitive to note a contemporaneous stock price, just in the interest of helping investors get better informed?
That's an excellent idea. Baby steps at this point to do that. What was your first question?
First question was just a simpler sort of how to use your Trace machine.
Well, it's not ours, right? So Trace is FINRA, and they do an excellent job. If people know it's there, it's actually excellent to find. And I should also mention on the Muni side, the EMMA system used to be the RTRS system, and it was just basically you type in a QSIP and you get sort of the log of the stuff. They have some really, really cool features on the EMMA website. As you know, the municipal bond market is highly fragmented and highly complex. And so for various reasons, issuers in the muni market don't issue, when they do an offering, they don't issue a single bond. They oftentimes do 15, 20 QSIPs. They do a 1 year, a 2 year, a 3 year, a 4 year. And beyond that, there's added complexity because across those series, they may have different features. Some may be callable, some may not be. Some may be sinking funds, some may be super sinkers, those types of things. And individual QSIPs don't trade very often, right? And so what the MSRB website has done is, as you know, a lot of people in the bond markets use matrix pricing and look at similar types of bonds. They've actually added a lot of nice features that make it easier to say, all right, not only do I want this bond, but I want to look at similar bonds. And you can actually toggle the switches to say, well, let me find the same bonds, it's in the same state, and then maybe then you can toggle it between 1 or 2 notches, say on the credit rating or on the issue size or something like that. And so, that's a nice enhanced feature as well too. But just making people aware of it, I think, is the biggest issue.
I wonder if you would comment about the Department of Labor situation with respect to duties that brokers might have if they handle retirement funds of investors.
Sure. Well, so here's another added layer of complexity to the regulatory system as well, too, right? So the Department of Labor administers something called ERISA, which is for retirement funds, which then bleeds over into our space on the brokers who offer, say, IRA accounts and that sort of thing, right? For those of you not familiar with this area, we've had at the SEC, there's different statutes under which different market participants are subject. So investment advisors that provide investment advice are subject to the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. Brokers who execute commissions and execute trades and charge commissions on behalf of customers are subject to the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. And they have something called a suitability standard, whereas the investment advisor has something called a fiduciary standard, right? And over time, those lines have blurred, right? So brokers are becoming advice, and investment advisors are offering to execute trades and those sorts of things. And so within the commission, there's been this question of how do we deal with that? And a few years ago, there was something called the RAND study that the commission did. It's something the commission's been struggling with for a long time. And the RAND study said it had two basic results. One, investors were confused about the standard of care they were under. But two, investors were generally happy with the standard of care that they received. Now, fast forward to the present, and we got the Department of Labor on the ERISA side is now changing fiduciary standards for people subject to ERISA that affect our brokers, that would effectively up the game in terms of the standards they have, their ability to charge commissions, and those types of things. And the difficult part of that is if you look at the proposed rule they had out and the re-proposed rule that's out there, it looks like it will be incredibly costly for the brokers under our jurisdiction to comply with. And as a result, my concern is that the brokers will end up having to charge higher prices, and in effect, small accounts will be priced out of the market. We saw something similar happen over in the UK. It wasn't the same exact thing, but it was very similar in terms of the ability to charge commissions in the UK. And what we saw was that something like 11 million households were priced out of the market. The concern about Department of Labor and their move going forward is perhaps that individuals are receiving what they determine is maybe suboptimal investment advice in this space. What I'm afraid of is the consequences that they're going to be receiving no investment advice. When the rule first came out, you had members of Congress from rural states were the concern that they say, well, wait a minute, if we have our local broker that's just going to close up shop, we're not going to have access to investment advice. You saw the same thing from the Congressional Black Caucus and people concerned about minority urban communities as well, too. On the re-proposal, you see the National Black Chamber of Commerce saying the same exact thing that's there. It's something that we're trying to push back on as much as we can, but it looks like Department of Labor is sort of hell-bent on moving forward with the rule, so unfortunately.
And we have time for one last question. Larry?
Maker-taker pricing in conjunction with taker-maker pricing has effectively decreased the tick size in the United States for equities to half a penny, but only for the most sophisticated traders who are aware of it and who are able to work the system. So I was wondering what your thoughts were about the maker-taker and taker-maker, and in particular how they might interact with the SEC's understanding of best execution and its perhaps excessive focus on market orders versus limit orders. Maybe we need a best representation standard.
Sure. So first of all, for those of you not familiar with the sort of the maker-taker or the access fees and rebates that folks get, if you want the best explanation of maker-taker and taker-maker and the explanation of the frictions that it causes in the market, there's two papers by Angel, Harris, and Chester Spatt, talking about the potential frictions that happen from these things, potentially limit orders being isolated on a maker exchange and those types of issues. This is an issue that's wrapped up in a number of different issues that we have. How does maker-taker pricing interact with top-of-book protection and those types of things? Is the fact that we see a proliferation of not only exchanges but different licenses within the exchanges, is that healthy competition, or is that just something that's due to the regulations that are in place, given Reg NMS and given access fees and rebates, which existed before Reg NMS, right? a lot of the things that we are dealing with in the market today have their roots in regulation NMS, including how maker-taker interacts with order protection, top-of-book protection, all those things, all those types of things. The speed with which that's going on. Best execution requirements under Reg NMS is effectively collapsed. There's a number of factors for best execution, but it's effectively collapsed to price and speed. So in effect, my colleague Dan Gallagher likes to say is Reg NMS created high-frequency trading. We not only created it mandated it, right? If you think back to Reg NMS, and I've called for a wholesale comprehensive review of Reg NMS. If you think back to Reg NMS, what were the concerns back then? Well, we had fast markets and slow markets, where slow markets were defined as individuals on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, right? We had concerns about limit order isolation, limit orders going out on NASDAQ somewhere and not being hit, so we wanted to protect those. And some folks were calling for a central limit order book, the CLOB, right? And what we ended up with, where all the orders were protected, there was concerns about, quote, too much intermediation, unquote, going on in the markets with the market makers that were there. And so we ended up with Reg NMS, which was a compromise, which you don't have full book priority or in that space, but you just have top of book protection for folks. And it was a 3-2 vote at the commission. It was highly controversial at the time. It's been out there for 8 years. The world has changed. It's time to take a fresh look at all of these things, including how maker-taker pricing interacts with Reg NMS.
Well, thank you so much. Let's all give Commissioner Piwowar a round of applause.